Xavi més cap a la dreta per Messi, 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 immens Messi, encara 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 Messi, gol, 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 gol,
Deleuze and Guattari's 1,000 Plateaus is an interesting book to try and explain. It's comprised of 13, rather than 1,000, plateaus, and I'm going to be dealing mostly with the two last ones, Nomadology and the smooth and the striated. They have a lot of overlap in themes, and their primary mechanism is to provide lots of examples for what a nomad is, and then to try and show what smooth and striated mean. The very basics before we get into football. The nomad is an agent of force without a home location. The nomad war machine is the roving force, not tied down to any specific territory that it defends. Pirates are one example. They don't have a home location. They go around the sea looking for loot. Wandering labourers, especially in the book it talks about metallurgists, who kind of have to go wherever new ore is discovered to do their craft. And for this video, Lionel Messi playing false nine. Smooth space is space measured from the point of view of the person moving through it, rather than from the perspective of someone looking at a map. Once space has been measured and points have been locked into position, it's no longer smooth, but instead, Deleuze and Guattari call it striated. Before nautical maps or charts, which were a fairly late innovation, Deleuze and Guattari say it's around 1440, the sea was one of these spaces. Sailors took their measurements based on how fast they were moving and what landmarks they could see, rather than by tracing their course on a map, because the seas hadn't really been mapped at all. The football field can also be smooth, it often is. The final third of the midfield, for example, can be a very long way away if it's dense with defenders, or it can be really close to you if a long ball can be put through. Now we'll move on to football clips and Deleuze quotes. So, football has a very long history. For what we'll call the modern game, there have been a few conventions. Strikers, wingers, midfielders and defenders. Each has their traditional attributes. Strikers are powerful and skillful shooters, where wingers are delicate and more skilled at dribbling. Midfielders are all-rounders who focus on holding possession and passing forward, and defenders are physically stronger than the rest and focus on tackling and clearing the ball. Each player has a zone on the pitch and a traditional number. Strikers wear the number 9 and stay around the final third of the pitch, close to the opposition goal. This kind of football has what we'll call an example of striated space. Both teams play the same formation, oftentimes a 4-4-2 or a 4-3-3, with the same fixed roles, against one another, understanding the team's process, because their process is also your own process. It's two teams which look the same, playing against each other. The striker knows who the other striker is, the defenders know who the other defenders are. Each person has their opposite man. Messi, under the management of Pep Guardiola at Barcelona, was played in the unconventional, but not unheard of, false 9 position. It had already been used at Roma, and it had its roots, some people say, in the 1930s, but kind of Pep Guardiola and Messi bring it forwards and change it an awful lot. So it's mostly a new position at this point. This position means that you appear at first glance to be a striker, to be a number 9, but when it's least expected, you drop from the attacking position into midfield. So it's a false 9 because it looks like a 9, but it oftentimes behaves like a midfielder. This gives defenders a dilemma. Do they follow the striker that they've been marking into midfield and therefore leave the space behind them empty so somebody could pass in? Or do they hold their position and therefore allow their team to be outnumbered in the midfield? Because if the striker drops back and both teams are playing a 4-4-2, suddenly one team is playing a 4-5-1, and if you have 5 people instead of 4, then you can pass around the team with fewer people. So when Messi drops out of position, he changes the striated space of 4-4-2 football into smooth space, and produces what Deleuze and Guattari call a line of flight. And that means an escape from fixed, kind of systemic orders of space into much more fluid, improvisational, creative patterns. The line of flight that he produces opens up new possibilities. When he drifts into the half spaces, there's a transition that Deleuze and Guattari would describe as typical of a nomad. Rather than being governed by fixed coordinates, he plays according to flows and intensities. So we can see this in the space, but we can also see it in the style of dribbling. So oftentimes the young Messi's first touch takes the ball backwards rather than towards the goal, and the speed at which he dribbles is kind of is what a composer would call maybe rubato. It's quicker and then slower. He's actually running an awful lot less than a traditional straightforward striker does. Oftentimes he's walking and then speeding up, and then when he's on the ball, he's also speeding up and slowing down constantly. And this is all kind of works together to make sure that a defender has to continually second guess himself. You don't know exactly where he's going. You don't know how fast he's getting there. You don't know if he's a midfielder or a striker. He kind of exists in all of these half spaces, continually in motion. The rhythm that he produces on the ball is so disorienting and so unfamiliar that he rarely resorts to traditional skills the way that other players and even other players that play the false nine have to. The only skill in the typical sense that he regularly uses is the body feint, and that's the quick redistribution of weight from one leg to another. Again, this is a technique that, rather than the kind of hypnotizing keep away style skills that Ronaldinho or R9 use, this relies entirely on making sure that nobody knows what you're doing. He's going one direction, but actually he has, because of his low center of gravity, among other things, he's able to change direction quicker than the defender who's trying to tackle him. He's more mobile, more nomadic, and more confusing, and that allows him to find space in between the fixed coordinates to pull those striated defensive positions apart. Deleuze and Guattari talk about the fleet in being as an example of nomad war machine. The fleet in being is the navy which is out in the sea somewhere but cannot be precisely located, and by doing this it defends both the harbour and the sort of sphere of influence out in the uncharted sea. So if you wanted to attack the harbour, you would have to take into account that there is a fleet which both can get to this harbour quickly and also could be out in the sea, so you can't really supply things in to the harbour either. Against this force, which cannot be directly attacked because nobody knows exactly where it is, opposing navies have to constantly be on their guard. Messi, who's neither a midfielder or a striker, cannot be followed in case he exploits the overlap later, but he also can't be left alone because at any time he could reappear in either position and get past your team. The centre-back can't both hold their position and mark the false nine because the false nine is what Deleuze and Guattari would call a multiplicity. The false nine is a threat both in the penalty box, where he is expected to be, and on the halfway line, where he actually is. His fluidity between these two positions escapes the striated geometry of defence which seeks to capture him. And Deleuze and Guattari talk an awful lot about geometry, and they have kind of two different systems. So they would talk about royal geometry, which is kind of, it's the shapes that we know, it's the approved forms of mathematics, and then also what we would call the minor geometry, and they talk about this kind of throughout the book, but then also in their book Towards the Minor Literature. And the minor geometry is the kind of, it was these techniques of maths in the Middle Ages that weren't approved by the church, but that builders used all the same. So it's kind of figuring out shapes that don't really, that don't have names in traditional systems, and then building in those shapes. So calculus was one example that they used before it was kind of adopted by everyone. It was only being used by Gothic stonemasons. But Messi here is using a kind of geometry that the defence just don't know about, because they are used to marking either a striker or a midfielder, but not someone who is both and neither. Now this had all happened by 2010, basically. This was pretty cemented as a style of play at Barcelona by then. And Pep Guardiola, he continued to manage Barcelona until 2012, using the false nine still, and also using a pattern of constant short passes called tiki-taka that he became very famous for, to devastating effect. And that kept everything on the field, including the players, but the ball, mostly, in constant motion. So nothing is really able to be pinned down, nothing can be sort of absorbed by the defence because they don't know where anything is or where anything is about to go. When he eventually moved to Bayern Munich and then to Manchester City, however, his focus switched from this kind of explosive attacking play that he had innovated to various strategies for stopping it. The false nine had become a mainstream tactic, and, as such, it had been integrated into traditional professional football strategy. Deleuze and Guattari describe this process as state capture. A new force is innovated by a nomad machine, and then, over time, the state, as in the hierarchical striated governors of space, not necessarily actually the government, the state is able to pin it down and make it part of their own capacities. They make it no longer nomadic, and they adopt what is forceful from the nomadic system and just use it for their own defense of territory again. So Guardiola's later play is oftentimes called like system play, and it's specifically engineered to eliminate the problem of the fleeting being that he kind of unleashed on professional football. So his defenders at Man City play with a high press, and this was happening to some extent at Barcelona, but at City it's crazy. It's much more pronounced than at any other team before, meaning that they frequently have their furthest back defenders on the halfway line. And this means that the false nine has no space to switch between, because if your whole team is compressed into your own half by the defense, then you can't get past them because it's so dense and it's so positional. Then that compresses the available space that you have, and combining that with a very strict tactical formation and a very conservative possession-based system where they focus on keeping the ball rather than advancing the ball. They don't try and mark the fleeting being both in the open sea and at the harbour, but instead, to extend the naval metaphor, they kind of just circle the harbour and don't let the fleet out. So any nomadic player is kind of hemmed in unavoidably by this kind of tactic. So his high pressing at City specifically targets the spatial conditions that made Messi's false nine effective, and by eliminating the halfway line as a viable operating space, he neutralises the territorial dilemma that centre-backs faced when he was playing Messi. There's no manager today who uses every zone of the pitch as mechanically and precisely as Pep Guardiola, and while he still uses the false nine tactic, occasionally even playing two false nines, he combines this with highly choreographed build-up play, a focus on possession and conservative passing, and a famously specific series of positions for each player at each stage in the play. When Pep uses the false nine today, it is just as Deleuze and Guattari would have us expect. It's in service of a much broader system. There are moments when Messi looks to have seen something himself and acted on it at Barcelona, but when De Bruyne, Phil Foden, Raheem Sterling or Jack Grealish, who've all at times played a kind of false nine role in the City system, when they drop back into midfield, it's almost always to ensure numerical superiority there. So it's not kind of just to create chaos and to create fear, it's actually deliberately because the play is about to be in midfield. So having more guys there gives them an advantage. So, like, to extend the naval metaphor even further, this isn't really a question of creating a line of flight, a way of, like, escaping the system which is commanding the whole field, but it's more about sending reinforcements. You know, it's not about sending your ships into the harbour or keeping them in the open sea so no one knows where they are. It's more about noticing that there's a threat in the harbour and sending all your ships in there to make sure that you overwhelm any force that arrives. So kind of we see the capstone of this systematization of the sort of previously quite nomadic Deleuzean play with Erling Haaland. So Haaland's role is a completely mechanical one. And for a manager who spent the first decades of his career disrupting on-field hierarchies, it seems like overkill to buy the most traditional, least creative striker in the world, but in fact, it's the final stroke in the state capture of the false nine position. Haaland is never going to be anywhere except the final third. He's rarely anywhere but inside the box. He scored more goals than anyone else in his first few seasons precisely because he was so straightforward. You have this team which is completely engineered to hold on to the ball, and then you tell them that actually they're going to focus that ball through a single, incredibly efficient, enormously and physically powerful point, and he's going to then put it just straight into the net. He's the antithesis of Messi as far as strikers go, but it doesn't matter, because even if the opposing team know exactly what's going to happen, they can't do anything about it. Barcelona was more unpredictable to watch, but there are still moments in the last 5 years that demonstrate what Deleuze and Guattari say about the kind of capture and creation process. The smooth and the striated, the nomad and the state, always exist in admixture, never separate, never pure. No matter how systematized City has become, and the fundamental difficulty in producing another Messi, which is kind of a position that he could only play that way, no one's really been able to do it exactly that way with another player. It's very difficult to see how anyone could be coached into being Messi, who had so much kind of innate capacity for rhythm and for vision. But even so, like, De Bruyne's long balls were impossible to plan for, and creative play still disrupts everything constantly. In the modern City squad, if you look at a player like Cherki, he also draws quite unpredictable plays from previously quite striated positions. So even in the most systematized play, you're going to have these little pockets where nomadic war machines sort of emerge and are effective and then are swallowed back up into the system. This is always happening, Deleuze and Guattari would say. You're continually trying to organize space is opening up within it, and then trying to organize it again, and then before you realize it, you've got nomads on the fringes of your empire, and they're inventing a new kind of metallurgy or whatever. My dialectic of creation and capture in the career of Pep Guardiola is obviously a massive oversimplification, and football tactics come and go in a fluid relationship to one another. Eventually, this kind of hyper-positional, orchestrated play will collapse in the face of another nomadic force like the false nine, which is impossible for that system to decode, which is Deleuze's kind of term for breaking a thing which appears totally new down into things that you can understand. So it'd be impossible for that to decode and break down into fixed coordinates again. And that will happen again, I predict, for a while, and then it will be captured again. But that's sort of the process we're in. Anyway, I wait with bated breath.
Xavi més capradeta per Messi, 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 immens Messi, encara 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 Messi, encara